what our students might be thinking about it. So let's do this. I'd like the panel, if you would, to introduce yourselves. And we'll talk, then we're going to get going here a little bit on what's going on with the election.
All right. Am I on? I'm still muted. There you go. Okay. Oh, yeah, I can hear myself now. Fantastic. Yeah, so I am Dr. Brent Hale. I am an assistant professor at the school, and I have done research related to political communication before. So I've done a variety of projects related specifically to campaigns and the way that politics functions inside of this beautiful country of ours. So I'm excited to be talking tonight.
Hi, I'm Dr. Anne Marie Cannell, and I'm director of the School of Interdisciplinary Studies and Professional Development. I'm also an associate professor of sociology and nonprofit studies, and I don't think I have any specific political knowledge, but no, I have a lot of opinions.
Hey everyone, my name is Lillian Scott, and I'm actually the producer of this show, so it's kind of weird for me to be in front of the camera and not behind tonight.
Yes. So Lillian is the producer for the show. So welcome to our viewers on the YouTube channel, the SM2 Media YouTube channel. Welcome, and welcome to our live audience. We got some live audience, folks. That's awesome. And of course, welcome to our listeners over WUSM Radio 88.5. So thank you everybody for being here. So Lillian, it's not a secret that there's not a whole lot of students up here. Talk to us about what did you encounter when you were trying to gather guests for this special event?
Well, I will honestly have to say that trying to gather guests, it's been a little bit more difficult than normal. Of course, we have the Friday show that we do every week, and we have guests for those. I think a live show talking about politics, it kind of put everybody on edge. They were like, yeah, maybe not. But other than that, I think if it was another time, another day and time.
So it's a little bit's the evening.
Yeah.
But also, didn't a lot of students respond that I'm not comfortable talking in public about politics right now?
Yes, I think the campus of Southern Miss, our beloved home right now, it's kind of, I guess you could say, apprehension about it, because a lot of students are on this campus and they're trying their best to, do schoolwork, do what they need to do, graduate. So when politics comes into the mix, it kind of becomes a little bit more difficult because you never know who you may offend with your views. So I think that was one of the biggest concerns for students coming on the show, a live show at that. Even though our Friday show is kind of live anyway, but I think it's just like a different setting. They were like, yeah, I don't feel comfortable doing this or saying this. What if I say the wrong thing? So it really becomes a different dynamic.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So are our students, and I want everybody to kind of weigh in here, are our students afraid of expressing their opinion in the current climate?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's very obvious, right? So it's one of those things where if politics comes up, it pretty much always starts creating a lot of apprehension, a lot of nervousness, a lot of anxiety. Don't really want to talk about this. I find this in my classes when I'm talking to students. They're like, I don't really want to tackle this. And anytime it comes up in any sort of conversation on campus, it really does create a lot of anxiety. And I think it speaks to the type of political environment we live in right now, which is just so fraught that feeling like you say something wrong is just going to get you dogpiled is something that really does turn people off in having a conversation about this sort of thing.
I'd agree, and I think it's everyone. It's not just students, because it's our family members. I expect a lot of people in the audience may have family members that don't agree with your political views. So having, Thanksgiving, actually I guess Thanksgiving will be after the election this year.
Right.
But even your instructors, your professors, a study just came out that said that, they did a study of professors, and professors, of course, have very definite political views, as is everyone, but they said that the majority of them will not share it with their classes. So I think, instructor, a lot of times we're pegged as, being overly, I guess, indoctrinating of our students. I was like, I've never been able to indoctrinate my students into anything, so maybe that's a problem. But, it's just that professors don't want to share because we don't want to be seen as pushing an agenda. So I think, unfortunately, I think that not willing to be, wanting to talk about it, or like you said, Brent, to be dogpiled, then we don't learn how to talk about it, and that's a problem.
Well, that's kind of where I was heading, is that how do we live in a democracy if we can't talk about the issues society faces? So how do we even do that, right? Or do we do it?
I don't really think it's a question of how do we do it, but more so should we do it? Because in today's time, there's a lot of controversial topics. Like anything that you can say or that you do, you get counseled on X now, which was Twitter. So it's really like students on campus. I feel like coming from a student perspective, like when I had emailed you, I was like, yeah, there's a lot of apprehension from it. And being a student leader on campus as well, you never know the backlash that you may get. So it's like, this is a great opportunity to share and to be informed and inform other people my age, but at the same time, at what cost? So even now, me being over here, I'm like, oh, let me make sure I don't say this or don't bring up this. So it's just, I understand from the student perspective and also as a producer perspective, working in the Student Media Center and things like that. So it's just like, not so much is should we or should we not, but more so of at what cost.
Wow. That actually makes me a little sad. We have some students in here. Actually, later, I think we're going to ask and see if you have any questions or if you have any comments. We'd love to have you on the show. But students, does this ring a bell with you? Does that feel right? That you don't want to talk about politics, about candidates, about issues, because you might be canceled over social media? No, you're shaking your head. You're proud. You're okay. Well, we'll get you later is what we'll do. So I think you mentioned X, Twitter. What is the effect of social media on our dialogue?
So I'll say that to get to one of your earlier questions, I think as an educator, as someone who's working with students, as someone who is instructing and teaching students, it's one of our jobs to try to facilitate conversations and to create comfort with having these sorts of difficult conversations. I mean, if I were to get students through an entire class and not talk about politics at all and not at all talk about controversial things, like, am I really doing something valuable? Like, this is part of education and this is part of going through a college education, I would argue. So it's really important. But what I see from students is you do have this kind of apprehension because just delving into something controversial is just hard to begin with. But then I've come to really understand, because of social media, getting to your current question, that there is a fear of being recorded and then having that recorded information on the internet. And so, the fear is like, I'm going to end up on TikTok if I start talking about something controversial, right? So, and I really don't want that to happen, and I think that causes a lot of shutdown for a lot of students. And then maybe there are some that are like, I don't care, I'm doing it. But a lot of students really don't want to. And I think that's really, as you said, sad. It's sad in a way, and I think it really does show like what we're up against in trying to create conversations. It's very hard.
I would kind of like to mention as well, like me being a communication studies major, I think it's easier for me to handle more controversial topics like journalism majors, political science majors. I feel like we all know how to handle those type of conversations, but when we're talking to, let's just say, business majors or sociology major, it becomes a different standpoint and a different viewpoint, because they're like, well, I have my views. It's not that we're not educated about it or that we are ignoring what's going on, but it's more so like, that's not my field. Like, that's not my place to bring this up right now. And being on the show, being a producer of the show, I've heard a lot of things, and I was like, I did not know that. So, like I said, it's not because we're ill-informed or too scared to talk about certain things. It's more so of like, should we, bring that up in this time, place? Am I qualified to do that? And that goes back into some theories of communication, which I'm not going to bore y'all with tonight, but
Yeah.
So many thoughts. Actually, it's interesting just bringing up from the professor point of view. I teach Sociology 101, and it's actually a very fraught area. When I taught Social 101 to students I literally broke if I'd been teaching in the state of Florida, I broke 2 laws teaching that class. And as a professor, thinking that I could be arrested because I am teaching my discipline is very scary. And I'm not gonna bore you with my recent week, but I just spent a week in Berlin, and there is a time period where people were, literally being arrested and shot for doing, what you're doing. And to me, that's very scary. But so, I can, imagine where people don't even want to be talking about anything, because, it's not even, hopefully we're not being shot. We're just, showing up on TikTok. But that sort of, I think going back to your original, question about dogpiling is that part of it is, I think in class, I don't have as much problem in class, I think, with students. Part of it is just that the issues are changing so rapidly that, again, there's that sort of fear that you're going to say something wrong and people are going to jump down your throat and say, well, we don't use that word anymore, or, you just don't know what's going on, or, you're dumb, or you're whatever. And so people are like, I'm not going to say anything because nobody likes to be attacked. Regardless of what side of the political spectrum that you're on. But then the problem with the internet is that, it's just so, what people are willing to say in anonymous, venues, it's just, nobody would actually say that to you in a class. Your friends wouldn't say that to you. Nobody would say that to you, and it's just, but
in a classroom, no one would look at you and say, that is ridiculous and you should be shot.
Exactly.
But on the internet,
yeah,
people do that.
Exactly.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, well, so it kind of gets me back to this idea of social media, right? Is that social media has changed everything. And one of the core things that has changed is how we interact with each other. And this idea that, I love this kind of surveillance idea that, well, what I say might end up on TikTok, and then it'll be there forever. And my whole career will be over. My whole life will be all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to go back to, this is a little bit in the weeds, but maybe you guys can help me a little bit. So this idea of Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act said social media companies are platforms, not publishers. So that opened the door to all of this nonsense that you see, right? No individual poster is, they technically are responsible for what they say, but it rarely happens because of all of the layers involved. So what do you guys think about this idea of the impact of social media on political discourse? And if we can't get through the technology to have discussion, then how do we have discussion?
And we will be back right after the break.
Did she? She told me to. Oh, she did?
I did. I said
Okay, we are back. And thank you, Lillian, for, as usual, keeping us between the ditches here on our rundown and our time. So yeah, basically we're talking about this idea of the effect of social media is so ingrained in our society, the way we talk, the way we gather information. We know that our students, that is their primary means of getting news and information is through some sort of social media, probably TikTok. TikTok students, yes, they're not, get some head nodding. And so what does that mean? So if we can't talk through social media, and we're afraid of the potential outcome of what happens on social media, how then do we have civil discussions that take our society in the direction we want it to go?
You're asking a tough question there.
I know.
I don't know that we really have a clear answer right now, right? So it's, the way that social media is structured and the way that these sorts of platforms function, they create echo chambers, and they're designed to do that because they're designed to create spaces that you hear things you like, so you stay and get sold ads. That's what their purpose is. And so there's no reason to break that down from the business perspective. That's just good business. So how do you break through? Man, you tell me. I don't know. Like, how do you break through this? How do you start creating conversations? Because right now, all that happens is I need to create viral moments that really bounce around inside the echo chamber. I'm going to show up and put on a McDonald's hat and work for 20 minutes, right? That the whole purpose of that is just to get that to bounce around in certain spaces, right? That's just how politics works right now.
And I think actually, I attribute this to my dad. My dad said never text anyone because that just, you leave out all of the context cues and you just make people upset because they're like, what did you mean by that? So always just pick up the phone and call somebody. But I think that works in this case too, is that for a lot of us, we do need to remember that we're in, basically the situation where they're just feeding us what we want to know. And the more we buy into it, the more it gets fed to us. And so, you can go overboard with, questioning everything. There is no reality, nothing is true. And I don't think that. But at some point, if it's on social media, even, me, I get caught up in, things. And I'm like, oh my God, he said what? They did what? And I was like, wait, stop, So, do some research. That's why research is so important. So it's like every single discipline that any of you are in on, whatever your major is, probably you had a research class. And that's why I tell my students is you may never be a quote unquote researcher, a professor, but learning those research skills is so important to step back and say, wait a minute, where did this come from? Where is this information? Who's the author? What are they trying to tell me? Are they, using some sort of incendiary language to get me all riled up so I'm not even thinking, in a rational manner? But it's very, very hard to do, especially when, and, the other thing we really haven't talked about, but we do is, sociology, is your identity. And, all of these, issues are very close to us. If we're looking at LGBTQ issues, for a lot of people, these are life and death issues, being told you have the right to exist or not the right to exist. And so it's not something that you necessarily, think it's like, I'm going to think rationally about this. No, this is to the core of your being. So, or if it's your religion, that's for the core, for a lot of us, so we don't think rationally. So it's very hard to step back. And so, but I think a lot of it is to, when we see these things, and I have a family member who we are, I'm here, they're here, and we're just like, we need to talk this out. So you saw this on, this video, let's talk it out. Let's, look at it. And, I'll do the same thing. Look, I saw this video. What do you think? But we talk about it. And it's hard, and sometimes they're like, what the heck?
Lillian, as the student, as a voice for all USM students,
Thanks for the
are
question.
students talking about this election and these issues face to face?
I would say yes. For the most part, yes. We have organizations on campus like NAACP, MPHC, the D9 organizations, and they're really taking a nice little hold onto this election because Kamala Harris is an AKA. So, we have an important role to play into the election, making sure that we stroll to the polls. I know y'all probably have heard that.
Really? I have not.
But, so yeah, I think the students are talking about it, but I'm not going to say that there's still not a fear of being canceled or saying the wrong thing, because I agree there are things that are changing rapidly. So we're trying to make sure that we do not say things incorrectly or misinterpret things. But going back to the social media thing, I feel like a lot of times on social media, yes, we should do our research, and yes, we should, kind of monitor what we, engage with. But you have to think about it. This is post-COVID. So a lot of the communication that went on was through social media, was through websites, news program outlets as well. So I'm not going to say that people my age or students on this campus are looking too much to social media for the news, but I feel like platforms like TikTok create short form content for us to get the big parts that are important quicker than reading a 12-page news article or watching a 3-hour show. So I really feel like, TikTok is not all bad, but it's not all good either. And, like you said before the break, between platforms and publisher, I was kind of mentioning like, it kind of is a publishing type of thing because you're responsible for the content that you produce and that you put out. So at the end of the day, you're the author of that content. So whether it's, Warner Brothers that you're, sending it to or not, like you're still the publisher of that content. So whatever you put out, make sure that you are well informed before just placing anything out there because there's enough fake news in the world already.
Yeah, well, I tell you, that's my next book, by the way, is A World Without Editors. That's what we're living in right now, this idea of everybody has access to everybody else, sort of, if you can figure out the algorithm, right? And so what does that mean? What does that do to our information? So let's turn this a little bit to the direction itself, to the election itself. So I pulled a whole bunch of polling information. So obviously what we're here to talk about is the presidential race between Donald J. Trump. Did I get that right? Donald J. Trump and Kamala Harris. Is it Kamala?
Kamala Harris.
Kamala.
Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris. So Trump, obviously the Republican, Harris, the Democrat. Now this is an historic election in a variety of different ways, right? One is that we have the first African-American woman at the top of a major party ticket. But there's also a whole bunch of other things going on, right? Is that how she got there is historic. Joe Biden actually withdrew, took his name out of the race after an incredibly bad debate performance with Donald Trump 3 months ago. I think it's just about 3 months ago now. That has never happened in our history. Trump has 34 felony convictions. We've never had a president, or even a former president, ever convicted of a felony. We now have the person at the top of the Republican ticket with 34 felony convictions and at least one assassination attempt. So it has been a busy election cycle, and the polls say that it is absolutely a dead heat. Statistically, there is no difference between Harris and Trump. Now, I did pull yesterday, actually, not today, but I did pull yesterday the poll of polls, or the averaging that the New York Times puts out. Nationally, Harris is leading 49% to 47%. So there you go. That's nationally. Now, we know the last 3 or 4 election cycles, the national numbers are meaningless. In fact, 3 out of the last 4 elections, the popular winner has not won. So that's interesting. So then you have to go down into the Electoral College, right? So the Electoral College is where the states each have a certain number of electors, and depending on the vote in that individual state, those electors go to that presidential candidate. So then that's where you go into this idea of swing states, right? So we know from the past 3 or 4 cycles that somewhere around 43 of the states are pretty solid, not pretty solidly, are very solidly going to vote one party or another, right? So Mississippi, Lillian, is what? I'll put you on the spot. Okay. So Mississippi is very solidly red or very solidly Republican. We know that Trump is going to win Mississippi. We know he's going to win Mississippi probably by 17 or 18%, which is not as big as, say, West Virginia was my home state, which he will win West Virginia, we know, by about 70%, which, by the way, when I was a reporter there in West Virginia, the Democrats got 70% of the vote. Now, that was 40 years ago, right? So things change. So if you look at the electoral map, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Hale to kind of walk through his analysis, which is kind of interesting. According to the New York Times, Trump is up by 1% in North Carolina. Harris is up by 1 in Michigan. Harris is up by 1 in Nevada. Harris up by 1 in Pennsylvania, 1%. 1%. 1% in Wisconsin is up, Harris. Trump is up in Georgia by 2%, and then Trump has Arizona by 2%. So that's the idea of the swing states, right? So you have a handful of states and a handful of folks in each of those states deciding who your next president is. So, Dr. Hale, what do you think? What the heck is going on?
Well, let me start by saying that the numbers you just threw out are essentially meaningless because all of those 1% and 2% differences, they come out in the wash because of the way that polls work. They have margins of error, so essentially all of those are a tie. We do not know. We can look at some histories on that polling to see what's consistently being found, but even still, it's so darn close in each of these states that it's super hard to have any clear idea about what's going to happen here. But you are correct. Those are the 7 swing states that we know are going to decide this, right? The other 43 are just done. We don't have to worry about those. It's the remaining ones, which include Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Those are the ones that are going to determine what happens on November 5th and the following weeks while we tabulate stuff. So I guess what you're referencing. So I actually have a map that I put together and put what I think is most likely going to happen. So here's where I predict the future for no particular reason, and there's no weight behind this because I don't know what I'm talking about. But I will say that.
Of course, if he's right, then we'll see him on the national news. And,
That's right. So you can now, all of you have seen this. You see what my prediction is. So we'll see if it holds up. So the 3 northernmost swing states, which would be Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, these are getting a lot of attention. Like a lot of attention from both candidates. They're spending most of their time there, especially Pennsylvania, because it's going to be hard to win without Pennsylvania. And given the trajectory that I've been seeing in polling and the kind of news that's being made about both of these candidates, I do think that Harris is likely to take all 3. And for those who pay close attention to politics, if she was to take all 3 of those, that actually already gets her to a victory, electoral victory, exactly with 270 votes. That's what I'm expecting would be the case given what's currently been happening. But I will say this, our politics moves very quickly, so any number of things could happen between now and November 5th. The southernmost states of North Carolina and Georgia, I think, are both going to Trump. North Carolina, he's been consistently slightly ahead. There's some weirdness in North Carolina, though, because of the hurricane. So we do not know what that's going to do to voter outcomes there. But it does seem to be the case that there's a slight advantage to Trump there. We also know that in early voting, over 2 million ballots have already been cast in North Carolina, which is about 20-ish% of the population, of the voting population. So 20% is already done. In Georgia, it's almost the same. It's actually around 2 million. 25% of the voters there have already cast their ballots. Trump has been holding pretty steadily ahead there. And we know from the 2022 election, where we had a very tightly contested Senate race in Georgia, that the Republican, even though he did lose Herschel Walker, who was not a very popular candidate in some regards, very flawed candidate, he lost, but very closely. So that suggests that there is Republican strength there. I think they're going to pull Georgia out. Arizona seems pretty consistently strong for Republicans from what I'm seeing. I think they take that one. And then Nevada is going to probably go to Harris, I believe. Given the types of strength that we're seeing around the Las Vegas area, I suspect that we're going to see some strong voting there. I wanted to mention a couple of other things here, too, related to specifically Arizona. So if you're not paying attention to what's happening in Arizona, Maricopa County is become a battlefield, essentially.
It's become a swing county, which is crazy.
And a very weaponized one, in fact. So when we look at what's happening in Maricopa County, election officials are practicing active shooter drills. They are wearing body armor. The election location where they're going to tabulate votes, they've got snipers. They're planning to have snipers on the roof of the building. You talk about the insanity we're living in right now, right? So that particular location is crazy. And I think that just all of that, for the way that I'm reading through the tea leaves there, I do think Republicans sneak through that one in Arizona. Anyway, I've said quite a number of things there. Any thoughts from the other people on that one?
I mean, I'm surprised that you didn't mention Texas because that's kind of been a couple headlines that I've read about.
What are you hearing about Texas?
I mean, they say that it could possibly turn blue.
Really?
Yeah.
I have not seen that.
0% chance.
Yeah, don't disagree.
But no, they were talking about, what's his name? I'm sorry. It's somebody that wasn't scheduled for the actual convention yet, but they were like, if he comes, it could possibly turn the votes from red to blue. So I think Texas is a pretty big state. So I don't know how many electoral votes they have, but you know, I feel like if you win,
yeah,
if you win Texas, you got a big.
Texas and California are your biggies. Yeah, not buying it. Not buying it. I have to go. I will go look it up, but I'm not buying. Anne Marie, what do you got?
I mean, I'll go with Brent, but I mean, the interesting thing, of course, about polls is whenever you poll someone is also whether or not those people are actually going to vote. And so, I mean, to me, I don't know, the interesting thing or maybe even the sad thing is now a lot of the news pieces that I've been reading are about the people who basically feel disenfranchised already, that it doesn't really matter who you vote for. So you vote for Trump, you vote for Harris, you know, what does it matter? And so I'd be actually interested from a student point of view, you know, do you feel heard and represented at the federal level? And, you know, does it really matter who you vote for? Does it matter if Trump gets into office? Does it matter if Harris gets into office? Or is your day-to-day life basically going to be the same, either good or bad? And, you know, it just doesn't really matter, because it just seems that, unfortunately, that may, in fact, and the specific place I was reading about was Georgia, and looking at people in Georgia, they're just like, you know, I'm not going to vote because it really, really doesn't matter. Unfortunately, one of the things that does matter then is the down ballot, you know, races, which a lot of people don't think about, that maybe it doesn't matter who's president, but it may matter who's mayor. It may matter who's your state representative. And so, and those are races we know even less about than the federal government, you know, what's going on with president. You know, we're so focused on that we don't focus on those other races that might really, or even other, I don't think Mississippi has any ballot initiatives this year because of, we just don't allow that sort of thing anymore.
And we'll talk more about voting after the break.
And welcome back, everybody. Yeah, so the conversation just rolls right on through the break, so that's awesome. So there is an interesting polling thing that folks have been looking at, is that this idea, and I'm gonna posit a theory after I say this, is that Trump supporters tend to be underrepresented in the polls. So when you have these very uber close races, it tends to go to Trump because his support isn't fully captured in the polls. And one reason for that they think, is that folks are reluctant to say, I support Trump. But yet they will go vote for him. I find that fascinating. Now this election, I'm gonna make a prediction that Dr. Harrell will now shred here in just a second, that Harris support is reported in the polls because the young people are fired up for Harris, and it's incredibly difficult to get young people in the polls because they won't answer their phones, they don't have landlines, they don't answer email. They're incredibly difficult to poll. So that's my theory. Brent, any thoughts on whether that holds water?
All right, the shredding begins.
Oh, I knew it.
And actually, it doesn't. I agree with you completely. So the way that this has been talked about historically, right, is you got this this silent Trump voter, right? This Trump voter that's very kind of sheepish about that support. But I think this time around that has really changed to where now a lot of Trump's supporters are so vocal about it that it's quite the opposite. And I think that what we're seeing instead is this emergence of the silent or the quiet Harris voter, who is a little bit less open about that support. And part of that is the gender dynamics that we're seeing. And so what we do know, especially, and this is particularly pertinent to students, we know that currently what we're seeing is this very clear kind of separation between young men and young women, where young women are polling very much in support of Harris at somewhere around 66%, which is a lot, whereas young men are coming out pretty close to 50%. So it's much closer there, and this is the biggest separation that we've seen among any generation that's been measured, right? So this is a huge difference, and I think what we're seeing is this kind of timidity about sharing my support for Harris if my partner is very vocal in the opposite direction. So I think that's creating a little bit of weirdness potentially in the polling, which is why I think, especially in the northern states, we're going to see a little bit more strength in Harris than is currently being measured.
Okay.
When discussing the gender dynamic of all of this, I think we talked about it last show of like, more women are voting than men. And I think, I kind of mentioned it as well. It's mainly because of the topics that are at hand. So abortion laws, women's rights to their bodies, everything like that. So I feel like, yes, we've seen more polls for women, but I feel like there are a lot of men out here that just, they're not as vocal, like you said, but I feel like they are still in support of Harris because whether you believe it or not, like, regardless of who you marry or how your relationship goes later in life, you may have a partner that, can't, carry a child but needs extra help carrying a child, but you done voted for somebody that is against all those different things.
I think you're very optimistic.
Well, I mean, it is going to be interesting. I mean, some of these, what we consider gender issues, such as the abortion issue, I think it's in, is it Kansas, which seems to be pretty red on your map there. But, and again, it might not affect the presidency, but it could definitely affect down ballot, votes for people, because, I mean, people are going to be, it's one of like, 10 states that has a ballot issue for abortion on it. So I think it is going to have an effect. The gender issue is very interesting because, it's not that Kamala Harris is the first African-American woman to be on the top of the ballot. She is the first woman to be on the top of the ballot. And again, I'm going to harp on Berlin. I've got severe jet lag going here, so I'm just going to harp. But it's like multiple people, and that's the fascinating thing is like how much other countries are focused on our election. I mean, the minute I opened my mouth and my accent came out, and they're like, "Oh, are you from the United States?" And I'm like, "Yes." And so, what do you think of the election? I'm like, "Okay, what side are we on here?" So even in other countries, I'm like, "Okay, we all have to test each other out." But that was something that they kept coming back to. It's like, finally, the United States is, a woman. That's great, but, it's like whether or not in the United States, though, because there is, if you look at it, actually, the last poll I found was like 70% of women, not just young women, but women in total were supporting Harris, but it was something like 40% of men. It was very, very low. So, it's just like almost switched. And so, I guess, part of it's going to be how many, of each group actually votes, but that we still have these very traditional ideas about gender roles and having a woman at the top of the ticket. Can we have a woman, who's the head of the army? Can we have a woman? And, for a lot of groups who have very traditional ideas, that's just, a hard.
Yeah, and I think I really think we don't talk about that near enough. I mean, when you think about the Harris campaign sending Barack Obama to downtown Detroit to talk specifically to black men and saying it's okay to vote for a woman. I mean, that's just fascinating. I mean, right? So I'm not sure, has anybody talked to a man that said, I will not vote for a woman?
I mean, that's something that people absolutely do say. Yeah. Like that's not controversial at all. Well, I guess it is controversial, but it's something people will absolutely be forthcoming about. And technically, we did have one other candidate. We had Hillary Clinton was top of the ballot. And so she was the first runner through this, but she was such a different candidate in so many different ways.
That's true. Okay.
That it's really hard to draw any connections between that.
Right.
But there were people at that point in time that said, I ain't voting for a woman to be the president of this country. Like, that was something people did legitimately say.
Speaking of Hillary Clinton, I'm really surprised that she didn't back Harris. Like, she hasn't been in the light of any of this.
She has back. She's endorsed. She has, but they are keeping her way in the back.
Okay.
She is
Hillary
not.
Clinton is
That's
so
why I haven't heard
unpopular.
She is
it would
so
not help.
unpopular.
Okay.
She
Would
would
not help.
clearly lose Kamala votes if she were
But
Kamala.
Am I messing that up again? Kamala. Kamala.
Versus Barack Obama, who's actually still very, very popular.
Yeah.
He is very popular. So the whole gender thing is really fascinating. So do you have men in your life who say, nope, not voting for a woman?
No, not me personally, no. But I think, like, if we had a researcher on campus when we were doing, like, getting people registered to vote, I would have loved to see those numbers, because when we were asking male students about if they're registered to vote, it'll be like a quick no or a quick yes, and they'll, like, try to run off. But regardless of if they're registered to vote or not, I mean, I don't need to know your business. I don't care who you're voting for. That's your personal, thoughts, beliefs, or whatever like that. But just simply being registered to vote, whether it's in Hattiesburg or whether it's at your hometown or in your hometown, like, I feel like you should still use your voice regardless of who you are choosing. And we will be back after the break.
We are back, and so speaking of voting, and let's touch some third rails here, right? So a big part of this whole I don't want to talk to each other is this idea that one of the candidates is saying the 2020 election was stolen, and that unless he wins, of course we're referring to Trump, basically he has said unless he wins, the election was rigged. So how do we deal with that in our society? This idea that one of the two party candidates is saying that unless I win, well, the election must have been somehow rigged or stolen or altered in some fashion. As a society, how do we deal with that?
Well, if you're Maricopa County, you put snipers on the roof, right?
Well,
That's
isn't
how
that
you deal with
interesting?
this. This is a very major concern. I mean, this is going to be a concern from now through to November 5th, through to all the way, into January. This is going to continue to be a concern because the idea of trying to create this skepticism about our system is, I would argue, tremendously dangerous. It's also something that is very much seeped into a lot of people's minds, and it's just going to be a very dangerous situation to be in. What do we do about that? Oof, I don't really know. We have to figure that out, I guess, in the next month.
Yeah.
I think it's very like egocentric of him to say that, but he has a record, so I'll leave that at that. I don't want to offend anybody. We'll leave that at that.
Yeah, I think any reasonable person likely would agree with Dr. Hale. I mean, that is an extremely dangerous thing to say. The system is so broken, is so corrupt, that unless this result is the outcome, well, the system must be broken. I mean, I don't know how. I don't know how you get over that unless the voters decide, no, we're not going to buy that nonsense. But it is a major factor, I think, in what's going on.
I mean, I don't know how you get over it either. I mean, because throughout our history, we've had various, hanging chads. I mean, that was not a bright point in our history. But I think a lot of it is just, again, it's social media, and that many of us are actually, we don't understand the actual what goes on behind the scenes. I mean, we're not there. I mean, we might go in and we cast our vote, and there's a machine or there's a piece of paper, and then what happens to it after that? Do we really know? And I think in that sense that we're not really educated, that we actually are not part of the, civic process. And so maybe that would be something good, that more of us get engaged and become poll workers and involved in the civic process and what happens. And so, when people say, well, you don't know what they're doing behind the curtain, it's like, well, yeah, actually, I do know what's going on behind the curtain. That might be the only thing that can actually help.
That point about understanding the civic process is so important. And I think that, you could go all the way back to our education system, our secondary, primary education system. Are we teaching students? Did you learn how the voting system works?
Which part?
When you go, how to go vote, what it means to vote, what happens, how does a bill become a law, all that kind of stuff?
Well,
did you learn that?
In middle school, yes, but that was like almost 8 years ago now. But as far as like just actually voting, going to the polls, I had to learn by myself. And that's of course because you can't really bring anybody in with you. So like I said, I went to vote over this past weekend. So as far as like making sure everything, like I feel comfortable with my vote being secure or whatever like that, they had me sign my name over the flap. And I thought that was kind of interesting because like you will know if your vote has been unsealed or not. So not that I'll ever see that piece of paper again to know if it's unsealed or not, but I thought that was very interesting. But like as far as like everything else, I'm not sure that I can say that I'm confident in what all happens.
Interesting.
So one interesting thing that was just reported today, in fact, I keep coming back to Arizona because Arizona is very interesting, is so The Guardian reported today that some mail-in ballots were damaged when someone set a USPS collection box on fire.
Wow, I did not catch that one.
That happened today. So if you want to, kind of think about creating this space where we're not sure about things, how better to do that than to set the ballots on fire. So
yeah, well, and you're gonna. So here's another prediction that Dr. Hale can shred. You are going to hear words like certify, decertify, sue, appeal, all those kind of words for months after the election, right? And now you get into very deep in the weeds about things like certifying election. But one of the things that the Republicans have done very well that the Democrats have not is infiltrate the local systems. So the voting happens on a local level. People kind of do misunderstand this. It's a federal election, but the states handle the voting. They're the ones that set when and how and where it happens. So if you want to know who runs the election in your state, you go to your local county polling folks. And Republicans have been very good about getting their folks into those positions. And there's been a lot of good reporting with folks who are 2020 election deniers, as in, yep, that election was stolen, Trump really won. Well, they are now in position in many of these states to certify the election as whether it was fair, accurate, and true. So it's really interesting. So let's ram through another couple of third rails here. Okay, so voting clearly is one, right? We touched a little bit on abortion, but both candidates have very different abortion positions. How important is abortion in this election, the issue of abortion, and how important is it to our students?
Oh, me. Okay. I think it's very important to our students because we have organizations on campus like Generation Action, and they're in partnership with Planned Parenthood, and I'm actually exec officer on that organization as well. So we work really closely with making sure that we did like voter registration as well, and kind of hearing and talking to different students about how they feel, not so much about each candidate, but about what each candidate says they're going to do. So it creates a space for me to see like, okay, students actually do care about what's going on and they are informed about what's going on, but it's more so of like, it's only women that's really talking about it. Men, they were like, okay, I didn't see how this is going. They're like, yeah, I'm not going to say anything about this, whether they're for it or against it. Again, not my business, but it's really, I don't know what to say for the student body. I can't speak on this one like confidently. So it's just like, I think it's important. I think they are taking the time to realize like this is a problem because you never know what circumstances you may end up in. So it really creates a space of uncertainty among the student body.
Okay. Immigration. Do our students care? What kind of conversation? I'm going to ask everybody on the panel. Have we had conversations with our students about immigration, which clearly is important to Mississippi, and it's also important to the two candidates because they've spent an inordinate amount of time talking about immigration or illegal immigration. What are we hearing?
I really haven't heard anything related to immigration because the abortion topics have really taken over the campus in conversations from what I've heard.
I agree completely. I think that's what I'm seeing as well, right? That immigration, while it is something that is certainly talked about in the state of Mississippi among the student demographic, it's just totally overshadowed by abortion.
That's a Texas problem.
Well, and in this case, it's also Arizona. It is going to be a big deal in Arizona.
Well, I mean, and I think too, I mean, it's, for a population that's in college, I mean, usually the degrees that college students are going for are not ones where they're necessarily going to find themselves in competition with, people who are coming to this country as immigrants. So I don't, the way it's presented, I think in the national news, I mean, just my opinion, I don't think it resonates as much with students who are in college, although all these students out here can correct me. Whereas, people coming from a more working class background, not going to college, it might, resonate more in terms of jobs and housing and things like that. Whereas I think if you're in college, you have sort of a different level of, I mean, I would assume for college students, I mean, the economy is probably a big issue. How well am I doing? Am I going to be able to actually get a job? Will I be able to afford a house? Has the economy, just left me in a position where I'm going to have, student debt for the rest of my life? That sort of thing.
So let's, we do have a few minutes left. Students, do you have any questions or any comments you'd like to, yeah. Shout it out. I think we can hear you. I don't know, we don't have a microphone. Yeah, so go shout it out and we'll repeat it.
I was just going to talk about, I was going to agree with the education. Like, I don't think we're taught how to, like, how the voting system works at all. For instance, I am now able to vote. This will be the first election, like the first presidential election I'll be able to vote in. I didn't know anything about absentee voting at all. I didn't know that's how we did, like, mail-in voting in Mississippi at all. Until my stepdad, who's a lawyer, was able to tell me, like, this is what you need to do. I didn't even know that was an option. And I think that's insane that we're not taught that.
So, so I think, I hope everybody heard that, but this was a comment about young man able to vote for the first time ever, didn't know about absentee balloting because they weren't taught, right? We're not taught that. We've got some heads shaking. Yeah, we didn't know it. Yeah, and I will say, if you ask me, give me a quiz on absentee balloting, I would fail it. I've always voted in person. And I agree. I mean, that's a really interesting, important point. And I will say, the system hates young people voting. They hate it. They hate it. They do not want you to vote. And I always say this, young people, call their bluff. Just call their bluff. Go vote. Just do it, right? Because you can. right? But it is a little hard, right? Now, in some states, like in Michigan, they have voting precincts on college campuses. Some states, like Mississippi, do not, right? Some states, like Texas, actively bar, as in it's illegal to have a voting precinct on a college campus, right? And there's a reason for that, right? They do not want you guys voting. Call the bluff, go vote. That's what I say.
Please make sure y'all go vote. If you all have any other questions on absentee voting, I'm pretty sure I can help point you in the right direction if you are registered in Hattiesburg. But that is all the time that we have today. Well, this afternoon. We hope y'all enjoy. Dr. Ed, could you take us out?
Yeah, I'll talk us out here just for a second. So this is a production of Southern Miss Student Media. We have a whole crew back there in the corner. Thank you, Dr. Martin. Thank you, Dalton Stanford, our technology operations guy for the school. Appreciate everybody. Shania, thank you. Lillian, again, thank you. So this has been a production, again, of Southern Miss Student Media, and thank you, everybody, at home, over the radio, and here in the studio for your attention.